Live. No?
Oh,
we are now on the YouTube Live. Welcome, everyone. We will get started in just a second. Welcome to all who have just joined. We will be starting in just a second. Kathleen, I just had to restart the PowerPoint, so.
We can be patient. Let me know when you're ready.
All right. You're good to go, Kathleen.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, preparing for the impacts of sea level rise. Rising seas are already affecting Maine's coastal communities, and the impacts will be severe. Representative Lydia Blume, who leads the legislature's Coastal and Climate Caucus, has introduced legislation to incorporate official sea level rise projections into statute. LD 1572 is a step toward enhancing coastal community resilience, and it's also a priority of Maine's Environmental Priorities Coalition. We are delighted to have Representative Blume with us today, along with Melanie Loyzim, Commissioner of Maine's Department of Environmental Protection, and Nick Battista, Senior Policy Advisor at the Island Institute. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Kathleen Neal. I'm the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 8,500 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today's event. We will hear from each of our speakers and then tackle questions for all of them in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait though. You can send your questions to me, Kathleen, through the chat whenever they occur to you. You can find that chat by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen, and I'll keep track of all the questions to ask during the Q&A at the end. If you have any technical difficulties, you can message Will Sedlak through the chat. This event is being recorded, and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, along with recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you all for joining us. And Nick, would you start us off with a little introduction to sea level rise?
Sure. So thank you, Kathleen. Welcome. Just going to talk for a few minutes, do the quick organizational plug for the Island Institute. We're a 38-year-old nonprofit organization based in Rockland. We do community development work that focuses on the marine economy, climate and energy projects, supporting small businesses, building education and leadership. Broadband's foundational to all of our work, and we believe all Mainers need the ability to use high-speed internet, so we can do things like this. From where I sit, sea level rise presents a long-term systemic risk to Maine's coastal communities. And, you know, broadband's the biggest near-term systemic risk. I think sea level rise is the biggest long-term systemic risk. Seas are rising. We need to start preparing for sea level rise now for a future when tides and storms appear in places that we don't currently see salt water. And over the next 30 years, our state will see an order of magnitude increase in coastal flooding. The Institute supports coastal communities as they grapple with understanding the potential economic, social, and infrastructure impacts and the cost of sea level rise, and helps provide them with information on financing and planning activities. We've provided over $100,000 in community planning grants, and through this work, we've seen communities struggle with understanding which sea level rise scenarios to plan for and in what timeframes. The choices are broad, but to make a decision, whether you're a community leader or somebody at a state agency like Melanie, or in the legislature, you have to make a decision to make policy. With sea level rise, it's not really about debating the science, but rather about how much we want to look to the future and make decisions, and what should we be doing today to help make decisions better for the future. It's inherently a set of policy decisions. It can be based on strong science, but the science can't tell us what decisions we should make today around risk and investments and what the future should look like. I think it's worth noting and emphasizing that the impacts of sea level rise really come from increased coastal flooding from the highest tides of the year and from storm surge. And to help shine a light on the work communities are doing to address sea level rise, we recently released a 12-minute video about the work that the community of Vinyl Haven is doing and what sea level rise means for their community. And so I think with that, the video speaks as much as well about this as anything else. So.
Holy cow. It's still coming. It's still surging in.
Every month we're seeing these water levels be higher and higher. There are some areas that we are going to try to protect at all costs. Really, there's three options: protect, adapt, or move.
My name is Gabe McPhail, and I am the Community Development and Engagement Coordinator for the town of Vinyl Haven. My job is to facilitate projects and processes that are undertaken by the volunteer committees that serve the select board and the town. Downtown Vinyl Haven really is the economic hub of the island in terms of where the majority of industry is, where I think all retail is. Main Street essentially serves as like the primary economic corridor for the island.
So there's three spots that I like to look at, and one's right here on the mill.
The majority of our income comes in July and August. August is packed. July is about 75, and June and September maybe 50 to 60%, but that's it.
I have a very sober conversation in my head fairly regularly about, 20 years down the road, is the property going to be worth anything if climate change, sea level rise is beginning to adversely, impact our town here?
I'm the eternal optimist in the relationship. He's the eternal pessimist, so we're balancing. But the unfortunate thing is that our kids are pretty much definitely not going to be taking this over. They've already talked about how when they run the Tidewater, this and that, and I'm like, I'm not so sure about that, guys.
Vinyl Haven, like many coastal communities, is susceptible to sea level rise and increasing frequency of storms. Their downtown is in a low-lying area. It's built essentially not on fill, but on granite quarried from the island in the 1800s. We're talking about 2050, 1.5 feet of sea level rise. A third of their commercial buildings are going to be flooded. So that's in the range of the next 30 years. So it's not a 2100 target. It's an immediate concern. What it means on the ground is that emergency management can't access certain locations on the island. They're cut off from the rest of the island. It severely affects the overall economic and I would say social health of the island. That means that our downtown might have to change, where it's located. I think there's scientifically no question that climate change is happening. The more literature that comes out, the worse the projections get. They're never getting better. The Maine Climate Action Plan is a 4-year plan to get Maine towards the aggressive emissions reduction goals put into law by Governor Mills. The emissions reductions targets were a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050 with a goal of carbon neutrality by 2045.
Most of the time when people think about sea level rise, they think about this very, very slow process that's going up maybe an inch here and there, you know, an inch a decade. It doesn't sound like that much. That's not that big of a deal. Think of sea level as the background, and then storms are on top of it, okay? In Maine, there's only a 1 foot difference between what we call a 100-year storm and a 10-year storm. 1 foot difference. We had a January and February northeaster and southeaster in 1978. That's our 100-year storm. So the 78 storm would have a 10% chance occurring every year with 1 foot of sea level rise. That's a significant thing when you're thinking about it from a standpoint of planning for storm events.
So I mean, at some point today, that road will likely still flood.
It probably already hasn't it?
Those 100-year storm projections from FEMA don't take into account sea level rise. So, you know, we've got both sets of maps now that are showing us what the potential is, with a lot of factors in between. But at the same time, you said, well, we can wait and let's just see if it happens. But it also means the infrastructure continues to deteriorate.
The Climate Action Plan calls for the increase of technical assistance to communities of all sizes. Of the 120 island and coastal communities in Maine, 11% have a municipal town planner. And 3/4 of them have no planner and very little regional planning support. These small communities are struggling on a day-to-day basis to address their everyday, imminent needs, and writing a grant report and working with an engineer to do a vulnerability assessment can be beyond the scope of what they have the human capacity to do. They need a point person to help them with technical assistance, and that's one thing that the Climate Action Plan is addressing.
One of the projections that we were looking at was, I think it was like 10 feet. Like the parking lot's maybe 3 feet on an average high tide. You know, so there's the elephant in the room, right? So we're talking about putting money into Main Street, significant amount of money to do this work on the sidewalks and the road and the drainage, all that infrastructure you don't see that has to be done today. You know, at the same time, there's this, well, in 50 years, I mean, if that's a possibility, maybe it doesn't make sense to have your hotels and your restaurants and your retail in those areas that are likely to be flooded.
I think for me, there is like this pervasive feeling of despair, and it is hard for me to ignore it. And certainly, I feel like part of my job is to inspire people and to engage people and to bring people together and have them accomplish things so they feel a sense of hope. I don't know how parents talk to their children about it. I don't know, even how neighbors talk to each other about it. Should I say I cry a lot? Because I do.
The Island Institute started to hear about sea level rise from community members. We started to hear about concerns around flood insurance increasing and working waterfront properties. A few of the ways that the Island Institute can help is through just purely, scientific translation, information out to the community members, raising awareness. We've created comics about sea level rise. We host symposia to hit on key topics that are important, like financing, adaptation.
A lot of great work has gone on in the state when it comes to planning and preparing for sea level rise. Too often these communities face the bottleneck of getting money to actually pay for this. These are not things that can be bankrolled through the taxes in any small town.
So here are the things I want you to remember from my talk. Mitigation is much cheaper than adaptation. Every day we hear about how doing something about climate change is going to cost too much. They are not comparing the costs of climate change mitigation to the cost of adaptation. There is not enough money in the world to adapt to climate change. This is not something anyone has ever experienced. There is no historical guidance for how to deal with a problem this size. It is our challenge to be the first ones to have to deal with it. And like all trailblazers, we will, of course, be the ones who get whacked in the face.
Chad and I have been talking about what the plan is, what kind of business plan we have to look at making, and how far ahead we can reasonably expect for this to be a viable business before we just can't do it anymore.
Main Street was just this economic, vibrant, magical community. And now half of it is gone. I can't tell you how much I miss that. And if I had only known back then how much I'd miss it 60 years later, I'd have played a larger role in trying to preserve it. One way or another, I think the determination to be resilient was to proceed.
It can be overwhelming, it can be really scary. I can understand why people would do nothing. I mean, I think people, myself included, I can become sort of just frozen with a sense of like, it's too overwhelming, I don't know what to do. But I think that there are just things you do because it's the right thing to do.
We can't keep sweeping it under the rug and pretending it doesn't exist. It's happening, and it's happening in our lifetimes.
The sea is rising, and we need to plan for it, and Vinyl Haven has done a great job of that. They're a small community, they don't have a lot of capacity, but they have a concerned group of citizens who are leading the charge to figuring out how their island is going to handle it. There are things that we can do, and it starts with educating yourself and educating your neighbors and convincing the citizenry in your town that this is a problem worth paying attention to now. You can read the Climate Action Plan. You can become familiar with what the scenarios are looking out 30 years for your town. It takes one or two committed individuals to lead the charge, and they're out there. They just need to come forward.
That was just an incredibly beautiful and thought-provoking film. Nick, thanks so much for sharing that. And for everybody, we will include a link to the film in the follow-up email that goes out later this afternoon. So you can take another look, share it with others. It's really something special. And I know that, Nick, do you want to add anything else about that?
I would just say a huge thank you to the community of Vinyl Haven for taking sea level rise on as a major challenge. I recognize at least a couple of the names in the participants who have either are from Vinyl Haven or have connections to Vinyl Haven, and would also note that Susie Arnold is attending today. So one of the stars of the video is attending, and so I'm sure she'd be happy to participate in the Q&A too.
That's fabulous. Thank you, Nick. Thanks, Susie. Representative Blume, what do we do with this, and where does the legislation that you've introduced come in?
Well, thank you for inviting me today. Where does the legislature fit into all of this? Well, we need to make sure that the state laws that apply to these communities are going to help them combat sea level rise, and to give the tools and to make sure the regulations that we're all on the same page. And so this resolve, LD 1572, is basically a foundational law. It's helping to put into statute through all of the departments that would come across sea level rise, from the Department of Transportation, the Department of Marine Resources, Agriculture Department, the DEP, and let me just make sure I say them all, because it's very important. This is about an all of government approach to this issue. Veterans and Emergency Management, Maine Emergency Management Agency, Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. All of these are going to be having rules and statute that have sea level rise necessary for their administration. So that's what this bill is doing, is to make sure that we can take those numbers that the science and technical group put together, 1.5 feet by 2050, basically in committee, we changed it to 4 feet by 2100. It was a suggestion just to round it out. Instead of 3.9, it is now 4 feet. We voted it out of committee on a very strong bipartisan 10-3 vote. I just learned that yesterday. It's still in committee. It's not been scheduled yet to be voted by the full legislature, but that will happen in the next couple of weeks. It is the culmination to me from when I first began here in 2014. I came to the legislature because my town was one of the first towns, the town of York, to put sea level rise in their comprehensive plan. And I wanted to know how that could help other towns and other communities along the coast to prepare for this. Ultimately, it is going to come down to communities, but the state has to be able to provide the guidance, the technical assistance. This movie was so good at talking about the details that only 11% of towns have planners, for example. We need to be able to help all of our towns and have equity in that help as well. And that's part of what the Climate Council is trying to do. So it's not just the rich town of York that is putting this into their comprehensive plan. And as people in the state and as members of the community, to encourage your towns to be looking at sea level rise in their comprehensive plans and in their planning is also very helpful. So we're looking, I feel like we're really making progress. Having this plan, this Maine Climate Council plan, is so helpful into really going forward in this long trek that we have to reduce our carbon emissions and become more resilient as a state. And sea level rise and flooding are going to be huge factors going forward. So I'm very happy to have sponsored this legislation for the governor, and I'm so glad that we have people to put it into our statutes.
Thank you so much, Representative, and it's great to get that real-time update on the status of LD 1572. We'll always share those updates out with our members. So for everybody who's on the call today, you can count on us to keep you posted. I'm curious, Commissioner Loyzim, what will the DEP do with this legislation if and when it is approved by the full legislature? What happens? What difference does it make from your seat?
Sure, thanks, Kathleen, and apologies for missing the introductions. Good afternoon, I'm Melanie Loyzim, Commissioner at DEP, and I'd like to thank Representative Blume for sponsoring this legislation. It is an important step to have the full legislature ultimately recognize the recommendations of the Science and Technical Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council So this was objective science that was unanimously accepted by the council, and if passed by the legislature, provides a very clear metric for state agencies to use as we evaluate our regulations, our policies, and our guidance. At the Department of Environmental Protection, we already have efforts underway to evaluate the variety of regulations that we implement, where incorporation of considerations for sea level rise are important. Our staff have known for quite some time that this is something that we need to be considering, and amongst all of the agencies, and also as a result of the Climate Council's work and the Resiliency Subcommittee, there are many places where there's the opportunity to make improvements and updates to our rules. And in some places where there's a possibility that the statutory authority we have just isn't enough to enable us to have the regulatory authority we need for some requirements and protections. And so this resolve not only gives a clear metric for the state agencies and our regulatory work, but also directs us to come back to the legislature with any roadblocks that we find in implementation. So it keeps the pressure on agencies to keep the progress going. This is a continuation of the governor's message that Maine won't wait. It continues to encourage action. Not everything needs to be resolved by legislation, but it is a clear directive from the legislature to agencies to use that science-based number that's been agreed to, and to not have disagreement over that number continue to hold up any kind of progress in evaluating all the other technical details that often need to be considered in our regulatory programs.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. I love the sort of real-time learning for all of us about the different parts of state government and where who needs to lead at each moment. So the Science and Technical Subcommittee played such an important role in the Climate Council and really communicating to all of us what the state of the settled science is, and the legislature sees a gap in ability to put some of that science into statute and then hand it over to the state agencies to do what you all do so well in acting on that. Thank you. We've had some questions coming in through the Q&A, but through the chat, but before we get into that, and I know we'll have a great conversation, I do want to just give everybody a little bit of a call to action, how you can engage moving this forward. As Representative Blume said, LD 1572 has been voted out of committee, but they're still doing a little bit of work before it gets to the full legislature. There is an opportunity for each of you to weigh in with your lawmakers to let them know just how important it is to support LD 1572 when it does go to the floor. So later this afternoon, you'll get a follow-up email from us with the link to the film Nick shared, link to a fact sheet about this bill, which is, as I said, a priority of the Environmental Priorities Coalition. And there'll also be a link to make it really easy to reach out to your state representative and your state senator and let them know just how important this is. So if you can each take a minute to take that step when you get the follow-up email this afternoon, that'll be fantastic. I wonder if we are ready to transition into the Q&A. We've got great questions coming in already. One of the first ones is, it's great to hear that LD 1572 would give communities the clear scientific guidance that they need about how much sea level rise to prepare for. What do they do once they have that guidance? What sorts of resources are already there or are being contemplated by the legislature to direct funding or direct support to municipalities for climate resilience projects?
Well, I could say that there's more foundational work to be done in order for that to happen. There's another bill that I'm working on that would help municipalities and multi-municipality regions, because a regional approach could be very helpful. We're doing that in Southern Maine here, specifically on sea level rise and shore resilience. And I think that we need to, from the state level, encourage that kind of collaboration between multiple towns so they can share resources and in a geographical, and something that makes sense geographically. And also resilience does come down to the community level. And it is up to a community to assess their risk and what they need to do in their communities, and what specifically is going to be the effect of sea level rise on their infrastructure. And I like, back into the movie, the idea of protect, adapt, or move. And those are the foundational questions that have to be answered by a community. And how we do it, though, is also something that the state can help with, because we can't just put up seawalls everywhere to protect them. We have to use, and that's something that the Climate Council came up with, is really enhancing nature-based solutions, natural solutions, because that's our best defense against rising waters and flooding, like marshes. So yes, there's more work to be done on the state level to help with that guidance and the funding of that guidance as well.
That's super helpful, and good to know that you all are thinking about that in the legislature, about how to direct those resources. Nick, you used the now familiar unmuting yourself as a sign of something to say.
Yeah, I would just add that there's a couple of different resources that the state can help provide for communities or regions as they're looking at sea level rise and trying to understand it. And so there's the dollars to do the adaptation work. There's the dollars to support raising your sidewalks a little bit, or to raise your wharfs or your piers up a little bit, or to make sure that your wastewater treatment plants aren't going to be damaged. From the Climate Council report, we know that the cost of doing nothing, the cost of not addressing sea level rise, is something like $17 billion over the next 30 years or so, which is a lot of money. That's a staggering amount of funds. A lot of that can be avoided if we are making smart investments in our infrastructure now and planning for sea level rise. To do that, it's really helpful for communities to have the planning capacity, to have the capacity to support community conversation. So Final Haven's really lucky that there's somebody like Gabe as a community engagement officer who is working with the town to engage her community in these conversations. Other towns do it in other ways. The legislature is considering a couple of bills around the Maine Climate Corps and around supporting we're standing up a Maine Service Fellows program. There are a couple of other proposals out there that are coming out of the governor's office around increasing the capacity for local communities to engage in planning. All of that is really, really helpful if you're in a small community and you're trying to move this work forward. Yeah, and then dollars for actually doing stuff is a huge one. But we have some great consultants in the state. We have some great technical resources. I see a couple of folks from GMRI on the call. They have some good support and programming for communities. There's definitely a lot of folks who are willing to help you if your community is trying to tackle this issue. But some state resources would certainly not be misused here.
And Commissioner Loyzim, you have the sort of dual role, not just of heading up the DEP, but of co-chairing the Climate Council. So I'm sure you're thinking about this with lots of different hats on. What should we know?
Wow, that's a broad question. Well, I guess I would add on to what's already been noted, that there are also budget requests associated with making additional investments in coordination with municipalities. The Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future is ramping up efforts to provide additional assistance to municipalities and coordination. As has been discussed, there's been a lot happening at the local level, and it's important to make investments in trying to help share that information, maximize experiences. As I just got a note in the chat for this meeting, question about whether planners for one municipality could be shared by multiple municipalities. We're looking for creative solutions and ways to, maximize all of our knowledge and to collaborate as citizens and as government leaders so that, nobody's trying to do this on their own, working in a silo. We can build on the work that everyone's been doing and really move us forward in making the right decisions for our future.
And that is so, Nick pointed out and clearly in the film, Gabe McPhail seems awesome and really an incredible resource. How, I know there was some news recently about she's got a new role with the Climate Council, right? How will she be sharing that work through the Climate Council process? Nick, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, so Gabe was recently appointed to the Equity Subcommittee of the Climate Council, which is really exciting. She brings a very, very good perspective to that group as somebody who's doing engagement in a small community and somebody who cares very deeply about making sure that all of the different people in our community who could be left behind aren't being left behind, and bringing that perspective into the Equity Subcommittee of the Climate Council is great. I'm very, very excited for her, and really to also incredibly thrilled that the Climate Council has an Equity Subcommittee. That's an important step forward for making sure that we're not leaving Mainers behind as we start to address climate change.
Fabulous. You've all touched on the potential that we have in Maine to learn from each other, to learn from communities like Vinyl Haven that are maybe on the front lines of this change that we know is going to come to all of our coastal communities. We also know that this is not a unique challenge to Maine. There are coastal communities in other states and other countries. How can we learn from the adaptation efforts that are happening around the world as we think about sea level rise?
I think that's a really, really good question. And in a lot of ways, it's almost a question that is easier to turn back to this group. I see some people in the audience, Alan and Leela and few others who are actively working in this space and helping their communities and their clients, if they're a consultant, do this work and understand the best practices of what's happening elsewhere. I think at the same time, it's worth recognizing that in Maine, we have a rocky coast, we have a relatively bold coast. And while we have some low-lying areas, and certainly the beaches in front of the communities in southern Maine are a little bit different, the challenges that we're facing are different from the challenges that say New Orleans or Louisiana or the Gulf Coast or other communities are facing. So we can take some of what's happening there, but we have to be careful in how we bring it to Maine. We have to be thoughtful. We have to make sure that we understand what's really important to us and what's really at risk. And a lot of that starts with the local engagement. And I would just put in a plug and say, I think our working waterfront infrastructure is particularly at risk in this state, and a lot of it's privately owned, and it's not a place we've focused a huge amount of thinking on as a state. And it's not related directly to sea level rise, but at least from where I sit, the Land for Maine's Future bond that the legislature is also working on is an incredibly important piece of securing long-term access to working waterfront infrastructure for our state, which will help with climate resilience and climate adaptation writ large, and the investments that the LMF program can make in working waterfronts can help people bring those wharfs up a little bit and adapt to sea level rise and make sure that they're going to last well into the future.
And I wanted to add that from a legislative standpoint, there's a national caucus of environmental legislators who we get together and we exchange ideas and what works in states, and the political realities of trying to get legislation through to help with these issues. So and then of course as a state we are also part of the compact of states that we're going to be aligned with the Paris agreements, and now so we have that conversation going on. So now we have the international conversation going on because of our new president and his realliance with the Paris agreements. So I think there's a lot of momentum to putting ideas in, and we need as many ideas as we can because we have to come up with creative solutions when it comes to where the sea meets the people, meets our built environments. They're not simple answers, and we really need to get creative and get as many minds on it as we can.
And I'll weigh in now that I've unmuted myself as the lean in measure here. I would also note, as Representative Blume said, at the state level, state agencies in Maine are collaborating with our neighboring states. I'm in regular communication with other environmental commissioners. That happens, with IF&W and Department of Marine Resources. But I think for this group of participants, a message that I'd like to deliver is that your input is really important as well. That oftentimes there's engagement at the legislative level, but when we get into the rulemaking phase, we put draft rules out for public comment, and it is, while having sort of form letters doesn't always provide us with a lot of substance, it shows support or opposition. But in terms of looking at what's happened internationally and in other jurisdictions, you are a group of individuals who care about this topic, who have an interest, that are doing your own research. And to the extent that you're interested and have the time, in state government, we're trying to put as much of these things out on the internet to make them accessible to you, to make them available for comment. So when agencies put out draft rules, our websites for DEP in particular, I'll put in a shameless plug. We do have an RSS feed that you can sign up for to receive notices of draft rulemakings. And we welcome the input from citizens because so often it's the usual cast of characters who participate. But the thing that's most impactful is the people who've got real world experiences, who are dedicated, who've spent the time to do the research. And when you give us that substantive and technical information associated with some of our proposals, it truly is helpful. So I'd like to thank all of you for your engagement in this issue.
Thank you. It's such a good reminder that, as one of the usual suspects weighs in, that advocates have an important role, but really we can't hold a candle to the experience, the lived experience of real people who are doing the work and thinking about these challenges every day, because they're happening in real time, right on your select boards and local planning boards and all of that. So thank you. What kinds of changes do you all think we might see at local planning boards, local select boards? What sort of ordinances might need to change, or what questions should citizens be asking when there's a new proposal? We saw in the film Andy Dorr talking about, hey, maybe we shouldn't spend the money on that sidewalk in the same place. Maybe we should think about where it needs to be down the road. How do we know what to ask?
And I think that's the great question here. And to go back to the resolve and the report from the Climate Council, one of the questions that we've seen communities stumble on is figuring out what level of just sort of getting through, okay, the seas might be rising, how much should we be looking at and on what time frame? And I think having a couple of clear suggestions from the state about where to be looking helps move those conversations forward from like, how should we be considering this? Should we be considering this to, okay, if we're gonna see an extra 1.5 feet over the next 30 years of sea level rise, what's in that range? What's close to the water now? What's close to the highest tides that we see that we don't wanna get wet? And that we don't want to get wet and maybe have waves moving towards it. You know, moving water is a huge problem. Wetness is a big problem, but moving water is a huge problem. And starting to have those conversations, and then starting to have those conversations about what is the length of time frame for the investment that we're making. If it's a 10-year investment and you know you're a couple feet above the ocean, then maybe it's not a huge problem, but it's worth having that conversation about your community's risk tolerance and the time frame for the investment. If you're looking at making a 100-year investment, man, I'd want to be thinking about, you know, where the ocean is going to be at the end of that time, and not just where the ocean is going to be, but what that means for storm surge, what that means for the highest tides of the year. You know, I think it starts to be an interesting conversation if you look at a community like Islesboro, where you have the year-round population on one side of the island, and you have a lot of the emergency services on another side of the island. They're separated by a relatively low spot. And so you could see a scenario where all of a sudden for hours or days, your emergency services aren't as accessible as you would think they are. They're not accessible to the people who might need them. I think those are the conversations that communities should be having, and taking out the element of, you know, how much should we be looking at over what time frame really helps people focus on the waters are going to rise. The coast will be, you know, look different in the future, and we can't assume that it will look the same as it did today. And so we need to be starting to plan for that and starting to have those conversations about risk. Fortunately, sea level rise is a realm where it's a longer term train. You know, you don't have to go out and rip up all of your sidewalks today and raise them up a foot. You can say, you know, we're going to replace our sidewalks in 5 years. Let's make sure when we do that, we build them up to a level where they'll be safe. Let's make sure that when we replace our culverts in our coastal environment, that we replace them with culverts that are big enough to allow the water passage that needs to go through, that don't then flood our roads and cost more down the line. It's about making smart decisions at the outset.
That makes just a ton of sense, and that's where LD 1572 comes in, right? That there are plenty of things for each community to wrestle with. We can take the amount of sea level rise, that number, off the table for communities by giving really clear guidance at the state level. So thanks for that. Is there, what's the role of FEMA in addressing sea level rise and the planning process? There was a mention about flood maps, and I didn't quite hear if those reflect sea level rise, or Nick's shaking his head. Nope, we're on our own.
The FEMA flood maps are often a source of consternation for coastal communities. They attempt to show risk, and they attempt to show where the 100-year storm will be. Sometimes they're not done particularly accurately. The lines that are drawn on them don't necessarily follow the contours of where the earth will be. Sometimes buildings are drawn into a map or out of a map or out of a flood zone. But really they're an important part of having the conversation about risk and risk management and looking to the future. They're a good proxy for, where's the 100-year storm now? We know that that's this level, and I don't want to say the levels because I might get them mixed up. The FEMA maps pretty much show where sea level rise is going. And so if you look at, I think it's a 1.5 foot or foot and a half of sea level rise, that starts to show you where you might start seeing some of the high tides. It's a quick glimpse into the future. They're not updated for what sea level rise is coming, and there's a whole, I mean, FEMA's its own whole kettle of fish that is probably worth a broader conversation, but yeah.
Fair enough.
I think one of the things that we need to do is to really have a sea level rise overlay zone or mapping that is very accessible to everybody. And we're doing a very good job here in Maine so far about mapping sea level rise in various communities with tools. And I think that honing that and making sure that people can see that is going to be part of the communication of these issues, because this is about forward looking, and it's to have everyone kind of on the same page there is going to be very helpful for us dealing with it, because we may not be building things for 100 years from right now, but we have houses that have been around for 100 years, and we have lots of private buildings that are been around for a long time, and this is an old state, and so there's going to be some real issues related to that, and how we're going to deal with that and have our eyes wide open is extremely important, I think. But so visualization tools, I think, are going to be helpful towards that.
Kathleen, can I make a quick addition? This is Susie.
Please do, Susie.
Yeah, so to Lydia's point, I can put them in the chat, but there's a couple map viewers that, granted, I like to nerd out on this stuff, but there's a couple really simple things that people can do to get a sense of their risk. And one is the Maine Geological Survey's map viewers. So you can see the whole coast of Maine, and you can put in different scenarios. And now that we'll have some good state guidance, it's not left up to the individual to just pick a scenario. You can, if you're looking out to 2050, you can go to the 1.5 foot scenario. If you're looking out longer term, you can now go to the it's actually 3.9 on the viewer, but the 4 foot scenario. So that's something that everyone can do who has decent internet. They can get a sense of where their house is. But don't be fooled if you find that your particular house is okay on the map viewer. Consider whether the road to your house is also going to be dry. And a great spot to look for that information is the Nature Conservancy's Coastal Risk Explorer. It's another tool that shows you basically all in the address points, all the homes are highlighted. And what gets highlighted under the different sea level rise scenarios is whether the route to that home is accessible during a flooding event. So it gives you a sense of whether you'll have access to emergency services under different flooding scenarios. So that's another one, because we've got a lot of peninsular communities. It's not just islands, it's the peninsular communities, and the roads down those peninsulas might be, so you might be at the tip of a peninsula, your home might be on a ledge, but that road to your home might be low lying and quite vulnerable. So I can put those resources in the chat for people.
Thank you, Susie. And I will make sure that those links get into the follow-up email for this afternoon too. So don't worry about copying and pasting them from the chat, everybody. We can get them to you this afternoon as well. You mentioned different kinds of communities, Susie, and how we've got, we're thinking about the islands, the coastal communities, the peninsular communities. We also have a lot of summer communities in Maine, the folks who maybe aren't on the same sort of like their direct livelihood impacted, but certainly their way of life. Where are the resources that we've been talking about in terms of planning support and perhaps funding support? Are those available to summer communities as well, or primarily year round? How does that work? Nobody's unmuting, which means we might have a question we don't know the answer to.
Susie, I'm happy to jump in if.
You can jump in. Was that, I don't know if that was directly to me or not. I was going to say that, yes, those resources, and Nick, yes, definitely jump in. I was going to say, yes, those resources, it's not a summer person, year-round person divide. It may be more of a private public divide in terms of some of the resources that are available through the state are available to municipalities and not necessarily private businesses. But there are also other resources that are available to private business owners as well. I just had a request from a woman who lives in a retirement community in Belfast, and they were looking to do a community scale erosion infrastructure upgrade. And she was asking me about funding opportunities for they're a private community. It's not a nonprofit. And I pointed her towards the direction, which is another resource that I can post to a compilation of funding and financing sources put together by Nate Robbins at DEP. And that's a fantastic resource. It's like a 4-page list of potential options to go to for money. So I can also direct folks in that direction.
That sounds great. Thank you. Cassie Rose from the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future is on the line as well. Thank you so much, Cassie, for everything you've done with the Climate Council. And she's pointing us towards the new science dashboard, climate science dashboard, as a way to explore historical sea level data and future scenarios. So I'll put that in the follow-up link this afternoon as well. And I think we'll have time for just one more question, and might as well be about money, right? Commissioner Loyzim, I know we heard a lot from the governor this week about where the American Rescue Plan and some of the federal funding that's been introduced, some passed and some proposed this week. Where does that fit into Maine? Is any of that going to flow towards sea level rise preparations and resilience?
Certainly, that's a great question. It is part of the overall package that's been proposed by Governor Mills, and I can certainly send to you, Kathleen, to share with your members the summary that's been produced of the various initiatives in the budget change package, as well as proposals for funding from the American Recovery Act that would all be directed towards implementation of the climate plan. There's funding for an adaptation fund. There's funding for additional municipal assistance, funding for wastewater and drinking water infrastructure investments. So the governor has very much applied a climate lens to decisions regarding allocation of those funds, and would be happy to send that along for everybody to take a look at. I'm not intimately familiar with many of the details, but DEP is also one of the one of the agencies that would be distributing some of those funds, $25 million for wastewater infrastructure, with a priority for those facilities that would potentially be impacted by sea level rise, as well as an investment in additional staffing to help us with the rulemaking that I discussed earlier to implement the sea level rise recommendations. So there are a lot of areas where that investment relating to planning for our climate also dovetails really well with overall investments in the state. We've got an opportunity to invest in both innovation at the same time as investing in climate change. And so it's been exciting to see the opportunities that we have because of that federal funding coming into the state.
That is really exciting, and we'll have quite a few links, it sounds like, for you in this afternoon's email so that you can continue exploring all of those resources. Please keep questions coming. When you get that follow-up email from me, if we didn't have a chance to answer your question today, but you're really looking to follow up, just go ahead and respond, and I can get either the right information or connect you to the person who has that right information. Thank you, Representative Blume. Thank you, Commissioner Loyzim. Thank you, Nick. Thanks everybody who joined today. We're really excited to be able to share this information. Grateful that you're ready to jump in and urge lawmakers to support LD 1572 and to be part of this ongoing work that we have ahead of us. I hope that you will all join us next week for a very different kind of update. We will have James Romister, who is the editor of SCOTUS blog. That's the Supreme Court of the United States blog, and he is known for giving sort of a nonpartisan update on what's going on. It's going to help us make sense of the new composition of the court and what it means for a whole host of issues, as well as the major cases that are on his radar. And we're teaming up with our friends at the ACLU of Maine, Equality Maine, National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, Maine Women's Lobby, the League of Women Voters of Maine, and the Maine Educational Association to bring that program to you next week. So I hope you will join us. Until then, have a beautiful weekend, and we'll see you soon.